Imagine waking up to find your driveway blocked by military tanks, their cold barrels pointing directly at your front door. You're still in your pajamas, coffee in hand, and you have no idea what's happening. The only thing you know for sure is that this isn't a joke. It's real. And the person behind it? The power-hungry president of your homeowners association. But here's the twist. What she doesn't know is that your father isn't just any ordinary man. He's a lieutenant general with the full might of the military at his disposal. This isn't just a battle for your home. This is the start of a war that will shake your neighborhood to its very core. The question is, are you ready for the fight of your life? It all started one quiet morning when I received a letter. The envelope was plain, no logo, no return address, just a blank piece of paper with a chilling message that read, "The HOA is watching you. Don't trust them. Something big is coming. Act fast before it's too late." At first, I thought it was some kind of joke, maybe a prank from a disgruntled neighbor, but the urgency in the message seemed real. I put the letter aside, unsure what to make of it, but it lingered in my thoughts. That afternoon, as I sat in my favorite chair, sipping my coffee and glancing to the local news, the sound of heavy machinery outside caught my attention. My heart skipped a beat as I looked out the window. There they were, tanks. Yes, tanks. Massive military vehicles blocking my driveway. The letters in my hand suddenly felt like an eerie prophecy. I rushed outside, trying to make sense of the situation. Who in their right mind would do something like this? And why? Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a series of events that would turn my peaceful neighborhood upside down. What did the letter mean? Who was behind this? The sudden appearance of military tanks raised questions that needed answers. As I stood there frozen, the realization dawned upon me. My perfect little suburban neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and peaceful streets, wasn't as perfect as it seemed. The HOA, the very people who promised to maintain the peace and order of our community, had turned into something far more sinister. But why would they go to such extremes? Could it be that the HOA wasn't just about enforcing rules anymore? Were they hiding something much bigger? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I was in over my head. But there was no turning back now. I had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. I had always dreamed of living in a neighborhood like this. A quiet, upscale community where everyone respected the rules, where lawns were perfectly trimmed, and where peace reigned supreme. It was a place where people took pride in their homes and their lives, and it felt like the ideal place for someone like me, someone who valued order and calmness. When I first moved in, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were friendly, the homes were beautiful, and the HOA, with its strict guidelines, gave the place a sense of security and structure. No overgrown lawns, no unsightly decorations, and certainly no disruptions to the peace. The rules were clear, and everyone followed them without question. At least, that's what I thought. But as the days passed, I began to notice something strange. Subtle at first, but undeniable once I looked closely. The HOA was becoming more aggressive, more controlling. The enforcers, like Elaine Thompson, the HOA president, began to pop up on my street more often. They weren't just knocking on doors to remind us about maintaining our lawns. They were inspecting every inch of every home, dictating even the smallest of details. No one was exempt. At first, it seemed like an overzealous attempt to keep the neighborhood looking pristine. But soon it became clear that there was something more sinister at play. I started hearing whispers from the neighbors, complaints about unreasonable fines, about mysterious inspections, and about rules that seemed to change without warning. Some neighbors had been forced to pay ridiculous fines for the most trivial infractions, while others were being targeted with threats of eviction. As I dug deeper into the situation, I realized that the HOA was no longer just about enforcing rules. It had become a system of control, one that could make or break lives with the stroke of a pen. The once perfect neighborhood was starting to show cracks, and I was about to find out just how deep those cracks went. It didn't take long for me to realize the full extent of the HOA's power. This wasn't just a neighborhood association. It was a well-oiled machine that had been slowly but surely weaving its influence into every part of our community. What began as simple guidelines for home maintenance had evolved into something far more dangerous. Elaine Thompson, the president of the HOA, was not just a well-meaning volunteer. She was a woman with power, a woman who knew how to use the rules to her advantage. The HOA had access to everyone's financial information, kept track of every property, and monitored every possible violation, no matter how small. And they weren't just enforcing rules. They were building a network of influence, using their control to enrich themselves. Residents who spoke up or questioned the system suddenly found themselves buried under fines. Or worse, threats of foreclosure. The power of the HOA had become tyrannical. I knew something had to be done, but I wasn't sure what. It was clear that Elaine Thompson and the rest of the board were using their positions for personal gain, but exposing them wouldn't be easy. How could I take down an organization that held all the cards? I needed more than just complaints and rumors. I needed proof. The more I observed, the more I realized that the HOA wasn't just about maintaining lawns and enforcing rules. They were controlling the very lives of the residents. And I wasn't the only one who was starting to feel the pressure. At the start of all this, I wasn't sure who to turn to. I was just an average homeowner. No hero, no special skills, and certainly no desire to get involved in a fight with the HOA. But something changed that day when I saw the tanks in my driveway. I realized that if I didn't take action, no one would. The neighborhood I had once loved was being ripped apart by greed and corruption, and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. I might not have been a politician or a lawyer, but I had something that no one else had: years of experience in military strategy and problem solving. I was a retired officer, and that background gave me the tools I needed to navigate this battle. I knew how to think on my feet, how to stay calm under pressure, and how to lead when the stakes were high. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the entire neighborhood. I started gathering evidence, talking to neighbors, and slowly but surely, I began to build a case against the HOA. I found out about the illegal property acquisitions, the financial mismanagement, and the blatant abuse of power. But I also realized something else, that I wasn't alone in this fight. The other residents, while hesitant at first, began to rally around me. We were all in this together, and together, we had a chance to bring the HOA to justice. But even as the community came together, the opposition grew fiercer. Elaine and her board were not going to back down without a fight. They had their own agenda, and they were willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. The more I dug, the more dangerous the situation became. But I was determined to see it through. I knew that this was a fight worth having. As I began my investigation, I started to notice strange things happening around the neighborhood. At first, it was small, neighbors whispering about unexpected inspections, strange vehicles parked on the streets at odd hours, and a sudden increase in fines for previously overlooked issues. But then it escalated. Late one evening, I spotted a black SUV parked outside the HOA office. The engine was running, but no one got out. It was a subtle thing, but it made my skin crawl. Something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like someone was observing me from behind their curtains. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a growing sense of dread. I started to think back on everything that had happened since I moved in. The constant inspections, the fines, the threatening letters. Was it all part of a bigger plan? Was someone pulling the strings from behind the scenes? I knew I had to act fast. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. The HOA wasn't just an ordinary organization. They were a force to be reckoned with, and they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But as the suspicion grew, so did my resolve. I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to let them tear apart the community that I had come to love. It wasn't long before I uncovered a dark secret. The military tanks in my driveway weren't just there as a bizarre enforcement tool. They were stolen property. At first, it seemed impossible. How could something like that happen right under my nose in a quiet suburban neighborhood? But as I dug deeper, the truth became undeniable. The HOA, led by Elaine, had somehow managed to acquire decommissioned military equipment, tanks, helicopters, and military trucks, from a surplus auction that had been operating under highly suspicious circumstances. The more I learned, the more I realized how deep this went. Elaine's cousin Marcus had connections with the military surplus world, and it turned out he was the one who facilitated these illegal purchases. They weren't just buying up old and used equipment. They were actively siphoning off government property and using it to further their grip on the neighborhood. The tanks that were parked in front of my house weren't just symbols of power. They were proof of a much larger criminal enterprise. As I uncovered this information, the situation became even more dire. The tanks were just the tip of the iceberg. If the authorities found out about this, the entire HOA could be facing charges for military theft. But that's when I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my home anymore. This was bigger than me. The future of the entire community was at stake. I had to expose this corruption, no matter the cost. But the question remained, how could I possibly take down an organization that had so much power and influence, one that could even get their hands on stolen military vehicles? The emotional toll of the HOA's crackdown was starting to show. The residents were scared of fines, evictions, and losing everything they had worked so hard for. I could see it in their eyes, the worry, the desperation. The worst part was when I witnessed an elderly widow, Mrs. Rodriguez, break down in tears. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, and she had spent the last decade caring for her late husband's memory. When the HOA handed her a fine for a minor infraction, an unapproved bird bath in her front yard, she was devastated. I had known Mrs. Rodriguez for years. She was a sweet, caring woman who had always followed the rules. Yet here she was, being threatened with a fine she couldn't afford just because she had put up a small decoration in her yard. The system that was supposed to protect people was now crushing them, all in the name of maintaining the illusion of order. It wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. Seeing her cry sparked something inside me. I knew I had to fight, not just for myself, but for people like Mrs. Rodriguez, who had no voice, no power to stand up to the HOA's tyranny. It wasn't just about birthday decorations or unapproved bird baths. It was about the very soul of the community. And I wasn't going to let them take that away as I started speaking out against the HOA. I quickly realized that this was more than just a personal fight. It was a generational battle. The older residents, like myself, had spent decades in this neighborhood, building lives, raising families, and creating memories. But the younger generation, the ones who had just moved in, didn't understand what was at stake. They were more focused on their own immediate problems, work, family, and other day-to-day struggles. They didn't have the same sense of ownership, the same connection to the community that we did. Some of them were skeptical of my efforts to challenge the HOA. They saw the fines and the rules as a nuisance, but didn't think it was worth fighting over. But as I spoke to more neighbors, I began to realize something important. This wasn't just about the present. It was about the future. If the HOA wasn't stopped, it would continue to erode the fabric of the community, and future generations would have no idea what it was like to live in a place where people cared for one another, where neighbors helped each other, and where we all shared a sense of responsibility. This fight had to be about more than just a few fines or violations. It was about protecting the legacy of our community, about standing up for what we had built and preserving it for the generations that would follow. It wasn't easy to get the younger residents involved. They had their own lives to worry about, but eventually I got through to them. This was a fight worth having, and they began to realize that if they didn't stand up now, they would lose everything their families had worked for. The more I uncovered about the HOA, the more I realized there was a hidden agenda at play. It wasn't just about enforcing petty rules anymore. There was something much bigger going on, a well-orchestrated plan to profit from the very land the neighborhood was built on. As I spoke to more residents, I began to piece together a disturbing picture. Elaine, along with several other key players in the HOA, had been secretly negotiating with developers to sell the land. The goal was to clear the neighborhood out, whether by force or by financial coercion, and then sell the land to a large corporate developer. I knew this had to be exposed, but the stakes were incredibly high. If the developer succeeded, it wouldn't just be the end of our homes. It would be the end of the entire neighborhood. This wasn't just a fight against petty bureaucracy anymore. It was a fight for survival. If we didn't stand up now, we risked losing everything. As I started digging deeper into the HOA's financials, I uncovered suspicious transfers of money, under-the-table deals, and shady contracts with developers. It was clear that Elaine had been working with them for years, using the HOA as a front to cover up the real agenda, profit. And the worst part was, she was willing to sacrifice the community to achieve her goals. But I wasn't going to let that happen. This wasn't just about saving my own home anymore. This was about saving the entire community, about protecting what we had built together, and ensuring that no one would be able to tear it down for the sake of greed. The deeper I got into the investigation, the more dangerous it became. I knew the HOA would stop at nothing to protect their interests, but what I didn't expect was a betrayal from within. I had trusted some of my neighbors, people who I thought would stand with me against the HOA. But when the pressure started to build and the stakes got higher, I learned that not everyone was on my side. One of my closest friends, a neighbor who I had known for years, turned out to be secretly working with Elaine. At first, I couldn't believe it. How could someone I trusted betray me like this? It was a devastating blow. But I soon realized that fear had driven my friend to do this. Elaine had used threats and intimidation to force him into compliance. The HOA had a way of making people do their bidding, even if it meant betraying their friends and neighbors. This betrayal stung, but it also made me more determined than ever. I couldn't let the HOA win, not when they had already started to tear apart the fabric of our community. I knew that this fight was bigger than me, and that there were still people who cared about what was happening. And together, we would find a way to take them down. But I couldn't ignore the fact that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought within our own hearts. Would I be able to move past this betrayal, or would it tear the community apart from the inside? The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this fight wasn't just about me or the here and now. It was about something far greater, the legacy of our neighborhood. For generations, families had worked hard to build their lives here. We weren't just residents. We were the heartbeat of this community. Our homes were more than just houses. They were symbols of the lives we had lived and the dreams we had fulfilled. The memories, the milestones, the sacrifices, these weren't just things to be swept aside for the sake of a few corporate developers looking to make a quick profit. As I sat down one night with some of the older residents, the weight of this realization hit me hard. They weren't just fighting to keep their homes. They were fighting to keep their histories intact. Mrs. Walker, an elderly woman who had raised 3 children in her small house, looked me in the eye and said, "My children grew up here. My husband passed away here. If they take this place from me, it's like they're taking away everything we've ever worked for." That's when I knew I couldn't just think about this in terms of rules and fines. It was about protecting the very essence of our lives, the places where we had loved, laughed, and lived. This wasn't just about stopping an HOA president from abusing power. This was about stopping a system that was willing to destroy everything we had built just to make room for the next corporate giant. We had to fight for the history of this place, the legacy that everyone had contributed to over the years. It wasn't just my home at stake. It was the entire community's future. And I would do whatever it took to protect ITAS. I continued my battle against the HOA. Something unexpected happened. People began to reach out to me from all corners of the neighborhood. People I never would have expected to join the cause. These weren't the outspoken activists or those who had been vocal about the issues with the HOA. No, these were the quiet ones, the neighbors who kept to themselves, who had lived in the community for decades but hadn't gotten involved in anything beyond their own lives. It started with a late-night knock on my door. I opened it to find Mr. Lawrence, an elderly man who had always been a quiet, reserved neighbor. He handed me a manila envelope and said, "I've got something that might help. You'll need it." Inside was a trove of documents, emails, letters, financial records that detailed the shady dealings the HOA had been involved in over the years. It was clear that he had been tracking the HOA's actions long before I'd even noticed. Over the following days, I began receiving similar visits. Sandra, a stay-at-home mom whose kids had grown up in the neighborhood, showed me spreadsheets documenting HOA fines that had been levied unfairly. Tom, a mechanic who lived 3 streets over, sent me photos of board meetings that had been held in secret, without proper notice. These people, who had never before spoken out against the HOA, had quietly been building their own cases. They had kept records, taken notes, and gathered evidence. And now, they were ready to join the fight. What made this so powerful was the sense of unity it created. These were people who had lived under the oppressive thumb of the HOA for years, but had never thought they could do anything about it. Together, we had the information, the evidence, and the courage to stand up. The alliances that had formed in the shadows were becoming the backbone of the movement. And as more people joined, I could feel the momentum building. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a fight for all of us. As the battle against the HOA intensified, I found myself questioning everything. Was I doing the right thing? Was this worth the personal toll it was taking on me? The stress of dealing with the HOA, coupled with the tension in the neighborhood, was wearing me down. I began to feel like I was losing the very things I was fighting for. The peaceful life I had once cherished, the relationships with neighbors I had worked so hard to build. It was in one of my lowest moments that I found redemption. It came from an unexpected source, Elaine Thompson herself. One night, as I was sitting alone in my living room, I received a phone call. It was her. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I needed to hear what she had to say. "James," she said, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. "I've made a lot of mistakes. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to help make things right." In that moment, I realized something. Elaine wasn't just a villain. She was a woman who had been consumed by her own power, by her own fear of losing control. She had used the HOA to hide her own insecurities, her own desperate need for approval. It wasn't easy to hear her admit that, but it was a start. Her apology wasn't enough to undo the damage she had caused, but it was a first step towards something bigger. It showed me that even in the most difficult circumstances, there was room for growth, for change, and for redemption. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would still be battles to fight. But in that moment, I realized that we were all capable of change. And that was the key to winning this fight. Not just the neighborhood, but for ourselves. As the fight against the HOA grew more intense, I began to see just how much this battle was costing the residents. It wasn't just about fines or property values. It was about real lives, real families, and real sacrifices. Mrs. Peterson, a kind-hearted woman who had always been a pillar of the community, found herself faced with a heartbreaking decision to sell her home. The HOA had levied an enormous fine against her for a small violation, one she couldn't afford to fix. Her story broke my heart. She had poured her life into that house, raised her children there, and even cared for her aging parents in those walls. But the HOA's relentless pursuit of perfection had pushed her to the brink. When I visited her one evening to check in, I found her packing boxes, tears streaming down her face. "I can't fight anymore, James," she whispered. "I don't have the strength." I promised her that we would fight this, that I wouldn't let her lose her home. But in the back of my mind, I knew how hard this would be. Not everyone could afford to keep up the fight. Some people didn't have the resources, the time, or the energy to go up against an organization as powerful as the HOA. And that was one of the hardest truths I had to face. There were people in the neighborhood who were being crushed by this system. And no matter how hard we fought, it seemed like the deck was stacked against them. But I couldn't let that stop me. I had to keep fighting for everyone, especially for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The day of the final showdown arrived, and it was nothing short of a spectacle. The community had gathered in full force, the tension palpable in the air. We had gathered all the evidence. We had exposed the corruption, and now it was time to face Elaine and the rest of the HOA board head-on. The stakes had never been higher. We weren't just fighting for the neighborhood anymore. We were fighting for the soul of our community, for the future of our homes, and for the integrity of the place we all loved. The meeting was held in the community center, with a crowd of residents watching closely as Elaine and her supporters tried to hold onto their power. As the proceedings unfolded, the weight of everything that had happened over the past few months came crashing down on me. The battles, the betrayals, the sacrifices, they all led to this moment. Elaine stood at the front of the room, a look of defiance in her eyes, but I could see it. She was losing control. The truth was out. The weight of her actions, the years of manipulation and greed, had finally caught up with her. And in that moment, I knew that victory wasn't just about winning this fight. It was about reclaiming our community, rebuilding our trust, and ensuring that something like this could never happen again. The meeting ended with the board being ousted, the tanks being removed, and a new chapter beginning for the neighborhood. But even as we celebrated, I couldn't shake the feeling that this battle had changed us all. We had learned that sometimes the hardest victories are the ones that require the most sacrifice. And that was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life.